Welcome to Upfront. I'm Mary Ruth Snyder. I'm the Executive Director for the Campbell River and District Chamber of Commerce, and I am thrilled to have with us today Dallas Smith, who is the current president of the Nanwakolas Council and also the spokesperson for the Tlowitsis First Nation. Dallas, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Ruth. Great to be here.
Now, what I normally do in the shows is I try to bring a little bit of behind the scenes stories about the person that I'm interviewing, because it helps for people to understand the interesting journey, and everybody has an interesting journey, and yours is no exception. So Dallas, where were you raised, like in your early years? Where did you grow up?
So I actually was born and raised in White Rock, just a suburb of Vancouver, but I came home every summer to, live in either Alert Bay or Campbell River as I grew up. I spent most of my summers from teenagerhood on commercial fishing out of Campbell River.
Oh, okay.
And then when I was 18 years old, I was in a life-changing motorcycle accident where I lost my leg and severely damaged my other one. And so I went through some time where I was just trying to figure out, how injured I was and what it took to heal. And my parents thought it would be better for me to spend some more time in Campbell River around some of the family, some of the elders that I've been able to, kind of learn off of for the years. And so we decided I'd go to Campbell River and kind of start fresh again.
Now, how long were you in the hospital for? Do you remember?
So it was about a year, on and off with various surgeries. So I had 7 different surgeries and was in rehab learning how to walk again for about 3.5 months. And during that time, I was able to get my grade 12 education finally sorted out and, sort of move on with my life. I had a few brushes with the law before I lost my leg and ended up having to do some community service after the dust settled. And so my father volunteered me to sort of be the audio visual recorder at a national fisheries conference that he was hosting in Campbell River as chief of the Tlowitsis.
Okay.
And so that was kind of my start into First Nations politics.
Oh, okay. Now, did you have any formal education, or did you learn everything from the elders and from your father?
Well, ironically, I was supposed to, after I lost my leg and we sorted all that sort of stuff out with my health, I was supposed to go to university. And then there was something called the Central Coast LRMP started up, and it was supposed to be a 2-year planning process. And so the chiefs had said, well, why don't you go represent us at this planning process and you can go to university after. Well, little did we know the Central Coast LRMP process would turn into the 20-year Great Bear Rainforest agreements, which I was happy to be one of the architects of the agreements that came out 20 years later. But after we got the Great Bear Rainforest done, I was trying to weigh should I go back to school now? Was the original intention, yeah. Even though I lecture at UBC and VIU and whatnot. So I decided to just let my experience work for me and continue building Nanwakolas.
Now, Dallas, how, after the accident and your parents felt it was better for you to come back to Campbell River, and you were doing community service, so how did it transpire that you were doing that, and then you ended up the chairperson of a coalition for that discussion? What was the process to get you from A to B?
We didn't have a lot of capacity in our communities in those days. This is probably 1995, 1996. And so just the fact that I was a warm body who could show up to this particular program all the time sort of got me in the door. And then I enjoy working with people. I look at things from a human nature point of view. And so it was fascinating to me just to have environmentalists, tourism people, forest companies, government, all these different sector groups at a table talking about First Nations values when I was the only First Nations leader there. And so it was interesting to bring more awareness to the community to a point where then I had a group of elders who would come to me with the meetings and sort of be my support system as we went through the discussions with everybody. But it was really just, you took this one step and then, okay, well, let's let Dallas do that. And then, okay, we're going to do this. And so it was just
So,
hard knocks experience.
isn't there a funny story about how you ended up in the position?
Well, punctuality is something that I struggle with to this day. Sometimes I used to blame it on my disability. Now I blame it on my kids. But I'm always 3 to 7 minutes late for everything I do. And so when they started up the first committee for what turned out to be the Great Bear Rainforest, um, they said the last person who walks in the room is going to be the chairman. And so I came sauntering in 5 to 6 minutes late with my, McDonald's in one hand and newspaper in the other hand, and the moniker "Hello, Mr. Chairman, we're ready for you" had sort of born out of that day. And so they decided I'd chair the group that led the protection of our rights and title at that table.
What a people's journeys never cease to amaze me, how they end up from A to B. So as you got through the first year and then the second year, at what point did it really kind of resonate with you that you seem to have found your path?
Yeah, it was probably 2 or 3 years in where I realized the accountability that came with the leadership position that I was working towards. My father is a hereditary chief, and he's been chief of our community since 1983. And so I've always known that I would eventually play a leadership role, but I didn't think it was going to be in my, early 20s. And so I had to learn how to grow into it a little bit and just, like you said, take some time with the elders and learn how to listen a little bit better. As a young, brash teenager, I thought I knew everything. And the elders worked that out of me with love. They beat it out of me with love, is really what happened. I got to spend a lot of time in the mid 90s with our elders doing traditional youth studies, which really still help me to this day in everything that I deal. Is just that time and energy that I was able to sort of absorb from the elders really prepared me to help try make tomorrow a better day for my people.
When would you say that you really felt comfortable in your skin? And like, when was it that the light really went on for you internally when you went, I've really figured this out, and I know that I genuinely know this is what where I belong and what I should be doing?
It was a bit of an evolutionary process that,
Okay.
eventually leaned to the real realization that, I had a potential to help make some difference for our people. But it started again with the elders going to me and making me accountable for certain things. But
Mm.
then I would bring that to the table with the sector model, and I would have other people from various industries come to me and ask for important First Nations perspective on things.
Oh, okay.
And then when it really dawned on me the first time was when Premier Gordon Campbell actually sought me out and asked me for some advice on some First Nations issues that he wanted to start moving in direction of the new relationship. And that's when it really dawned on me that my voice was being heard, and it was really important to make sure that that voice was full of fact, and all the information that I was able to, soak in and absorb from the elders over time has simply been my playbook of just, being transparent and being accountable. And my voice has gotten a little bit louder as the years have gone by, and to a point where now we're able to, start to focus on passing that information down to you. So while I'm not an elder by any means yet, I have a couple of young proteges who work within our organization that, who've shown some of the same aptitudes that some of the elders saw in me. And so it's really about, passing it forward and helping the community continue to have that ability to have some champions.
At what point did the council, the Nanwakolas Council, come to be? And what role did you play in bringing the nations together for that?
So I guess technically I founded Nanwakolas Council with the Societies Act papers that we drew up and whatnot. But one of the challenges that we had over the years as we were trying to do land use planning and marine use planning was our relationship with the federal government dictated that we had to spend all of our money every year. And so we would have a certain amount of planning money. And as anyone knows, to build a good community plan, whether it be First Nations community, city community, municipal, it takes a couple of years to really build that.
Right.
And so the chiefs told us to build an organization that could be responsible for land use planning and land use management. And so that's where Nanwakolas was born. So in 2007, we incorporated Nanwakolas Council, at that time with 9 member First Nations. We're down to 6. A couple have taken their ball and gone home, but we've still got 6 nations that have existed since 2007 trying to work together on resource issues.
And what are the 6 nations that are still involved in the council?
So right now we have the Tlowitsis Nation, we have the Awitla Nation, we have the Comox Nation, we have the Mamalela Nation, we have Wiwak and Wiwak. That's 6. Yeah, I have to count on my fingers.
Sorry, I wasn't counting.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, let's talk about. Let's jump forward to the end of the Great Bear Rainforest Agreement, and how long that you say that took 20 years to rectify?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the Great Bear Rainforest started, I guess, through, like I said, the Central Coast LRMP in the mid-90s, and we signed the final agreements with Premier Christy Clark in 2015.
Well, why do you think it took so long?
It was a different time. First Nations weren't really welcome at the table when we first began. It was only because of the province's obligation to consult with First Nations communities that we actually had a spot at the table. And so over the years, we watched the bun fight continue between the environmentalists and the forest company. And because there was the market campaign against BC wood products that went to Europe, government really got involved in it. And so for the first 5 years of the Great Bear Rainforest, we simply watched those 3 fight with each other. And from time to time, someone would ask what we thought about it. And during that time, we're building our community plans and building our land use plans for our traditional territories. And so while they were arguing, we were working with our community. Once we had these plans in our hand, we were able to go to the table in earnest in probably 2011, 2009, I guess, is when we started really finding our place at the table. But we were able to go from our plans. Instead of reacting to what everybody else was trying to do in our territories, we were able to go to the table with our plans, armed with our plans and direction from our communities to make our communities a better place to live, both ecologically, economically, and from a human well-being component, which are the 3 pillars of the Great Bear Rainforest.
That is a phenomenal story. I think one of the from a totally outsider's perspective, in about 4 years ago, I had the privilege of attending Chief Bob Joseph's day-long workshop on working effectively with Indigenous peoples, and it's sort of a 8-hour crash course in the history, and it takes you literally from the beginning of the Indian Act and then right through to the end. And one of the questions was, when did the last residential school close? And everybody put up their hands and they all said, 1950s and 1960s. I don't think anybody guessed the 70s. And then when they said, actually, the last residential school closed in 1996, you could have heard a pin drop in that room. And knowing that there was no public knowledge, because the media never communicated any of it, because the government didn't want any of it communicated, and nobody paid attention to what the First Nations were saying for well over 100 years. It actually doesn't surprise, knowing that even just 4 years ago, there was still no understanding of when the last residential school closed. So it doesn't surprise me that that agreement took 20 years to get to that place. Have you been surprised over the last 5 years how the First Nations seem and you can correct me if I'm incorrect in this, to have really gained the general public's attention with the explosion of information that has come forward over the last 5 years. And it's completely made everybody do a 180 in shock and horror. Are you surprised that it took so long, or are you like, explain the last 4 or 5 years to me from your perspective?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of change over the last 4 or 5 years for sure. Unfortunately, status quo still really is the common denominator, but the time for change is now, and we're seeing the willingness for change. And so it's really important to see through all what's going on. There's so much going on with the emotional trauma that still exists from residential school and things like that, to really keep our eye on the ball of making our communities better places to live. The atrocities of the grave sites, unmarked grave sites in residential schools, isn't a surprise to any of us First Nations leaders. We've known this for years because everybody's had a cousin who didn't come home, or a brother or sister who didn't come home. And it's not that we never quit talking about it. We just quit talking about it to anybody else amongst ourselves. And so when these revelations started to come through, it was really hard to stay focused on the path that we were on. And I guess an example I'll use is, for the first 10 years of my career, we weren't allowed to share anything traditional. We weren't allowed to talk about place names. We weren't allowed to talk about different cultural reasons of why areas mattered, because every time our elders shared information, it got used against them. And so it took a while for some of the healing to take place, where our people got comfortable actually sharing where we came from and why we come from some of those areas, and really being able to go forward in championing why First Nations and Indigenous voices need to be part of the management of these areas, not only because we've been here for 10,000 years, but just to give some path of hope going forward, that as a distinct people, we're still going to be honored and recognized, but at the same time, we're going to lift up our level of human well-being to become commensurate with that of the average Canadian. The average Canadian doesn't understand that most First Nations live in poverty and third world situations.
Right.
While they see it might be grim, and the access to credit hides some of it a little bit better, but the fundamental challenges in our communities face aren't that much different than what's faced in Africa or in parts of India and other places like that. And so it's really been important for First Nations leaders to continue to raise the floor. The treaty process is supposed to be there about, what the ceiling looks like, but it's been really important in the work that I've done over the last 10 years to raise the floor, because that's going to help the most people for our communities.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing that, and for providing your perspective on that. That's incredibly important for us to hear. Now, in your work, it really evolved over the last 30 years now, especially as the spokesperson for the Tlowitsis, and also as the president of the Nanwakolas Council. Last fall, and probably for a long time before that, but I'm focused on last fall, you were heavily involved in the negotiations with the BC government on the forestry old growth agreement. Can you walk us through that and how that evolved, and what it actually means? And you finally did sign an agreement in January. So if you can explain that to us, what it means for you, what it means for the government, what it means for the companies, and how the next few years will unfold based on that agreement.
Definitely. We've been working on Cedar for a number of years, well before the province started realizing that there was a old growth management problem. My father roadblocked the Seneca Valley in 1991, I believe it was, and I got pulled out of school in Vancouver, or in the Lower Mainland, to come be on the roadblock. And that was sort of my first brush with how important Cedar was to our community. It's a tree of life. Cedar has probably 500 different uses within our communities, from clothing to housing to ceremonial to traditional wear. from biodiversity values that are important to our people. And so it's been a concern for us for a while. And what really brought it to a head for us was in one of our communities, they were building a new big house, a new ceremonial big house, longhouse. And we couldn't find logs of the proper dimension to actually be the corner posts. And so we actually had to go hat in hand to some of our relatives in Rivers Inlet, a little bit farther up the coast, and ask them if we could have a couple logs from their territory to build our big house. And that's when the chiefs really realized that there's a significant problem that they had to intervene in. Till then, you know, we managed our backyards and we managed our reserves, but our voices in the rest of our traditional territory weren't really heard or acknowledged very well. And certain court cases have evolved that. And, you know, some of the initiatives that we've taken on our own have led towards, you know, where we're working now. But, you know, 6-7 years ago, it wasn't a discussion many people wanted to have. And so we realized that there was a problem internally for us as Kwakwaka'wakw people. And so we started to use some of our capacity to identify existing large cultural cedar. So Nanwakolas has what's called our large cultural cedar program, where we've identified over 1,100 different trees of sizable dimension to be held in trust for future generations to use for canoe logs and whatnot. And so we've worked with each of the companies that operate within our territories. We've made them sign agreements acknowledging that these big trees are there and no longer can be harvested unless it's for our use.
Okay.
So we may open up an area to be logged and a big tree may come down, but it's going to be for a canoe or for a big house log or a totem pole. And so that's something that we started about 5 years ago just through voluntary practices with the companies. But last November, we signed a comprehensive agreement with majority of the companies who operate in our territories just around where these trees were, what the protocol was to talk about them, to plan around them.
Okay.
And then we talked to the province about it because we wanted to hardwire it. We wanted to put some legislative tools to protect what was going on in there. And the province started their own old growth review. And unfortunately, their process was heavily skewed towards the environmental community. And I've worked with the environmental community for years. I'm glad that they bring awareness to issues that our communities face. But this was really a one-sided discussion that didn't take into consideration all the other things we need to as governments.
Right.
We need to talk about worker transition. We need to talk about the impacts on communities if we curtail the amount of timber that's out there. So we're working over the next couple of years with each of the companies to do more deferrals, but understand to mitigate the impacts that will result in the communities. Because I have people working in the forest industry too.
Yes.
And so to heavy-handedly make some plans that just cut jobs wasn't something I was comfortable in doing. Poverty is a very challenging thing. Our First Nations have been able to manage it, but if everybody in the region's poor, it just makes the region that much harder to sustain itself. We watched what happened during the strike with Western Forest Products and the impact that had on the North Island. So all these things had to be part of the equation of a solution that had to go forward. And we finally, instead of waiting for someone to do it for us, we took the initiative to go to the province and the forest companies and say, okay, this is the deferral process we want to work through. So in January, we announced an agreement with Western Forest Products around the deferral process within TFL 39, which is central North Vancouver Island, sort of from, I guess, 50 kilometers north of Sayward to 20 kilometers south of Sayward, that sort of area in there. Okay. And that's a bite-sized piece that we're able to figure out, okay, this is the impact. We can manage this impact. We can harvest other second growth areas to keep people working. And over the next year and a half, we're going to be working with the other companies for some more deferral areas, taking into consideration all those factors that we just talked about, because we really believe in community well-being.
So as the discussions move forward, you'll be talking with all the other companies over the next couple of years to put into place the same level of agreement, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We are starting to run short on time, which I'm not surprised. So I want to quickly have you walk us through the new coalition of First Nations around finfish. There was a big announcement at the end of March. Can you explain to us what that means?
Definitely. So my hobbies seem to be old growth management and aquaculture lately,
Okay.
which isn't winning me a lot of friends, but it is an important discussion that has to happen because of the impacts to communities. And so, aquaculture over the years has really, it started off on a bad foot. Aquaculture has been happening in my territories for 30 years.
Mhm.
The first 15 of them, we had no discussion with companies whatsoever. They're Norwegian companies. They're very Norwegian focused. They only talked to us when they had to, as per consultation requirements. But over the last, 6 to 8 years, we've seen some change in their leadership, and they've actually reached out and started to build working relationships with the communities that they operate in.
Okay.
We all watched the Broughton Archipelago process where the three nations within the Broughton Archipelago decided they want to transition farms out of their territories.
Right.
When we respected that process and it was important, but there's 14 to 15 other First Nations who have aquaculture in their territories, and they have a level of comfort with it. They understand the economics, they understand the oversight opportunities and management opportunities that are there, and they understand the job creation that comes from it. There's over 400 full-time First Nation jobs from reserves in the aquaculture industry right now.
Okay.
And these licenses were all set to expire in June of this year. And so we had to develop the coalition for First Nations for Finfish Aquaculture. And ironically, I only chose that name because the acronym's FFS, potty mouth. I know no one's really gotten that. I haven't really gotten a lot of chuckles that I was hoping to get out of that. But the coalition had to come together because we've seen the challenges and the division that aquaculture has brought.
Right.
And so each of these nations had to find some united nature to stand together and make sure that the values that we manage upon are heard by not only government, but the general public. So they start to understand that it's not as skewed as the activists seem to make it want to sound.
Okay.
The activists like to talk about how aquaculture was done 20 years ago. Through the First Nations oversight over the years, aquaculture's evolved their practices and processes. They've invested millions of dollars into more sustainable technologies. There is still a lot of work that needs to be done, but we're working closely with them every day to make sure that everything that's done is done as sustainably as possibly.
Okay.
And the other thing to point out is we need food security. And aquaculture provides the lowest carbon footprint for sustainable protein production.
Right.
And
Okay.
I mean, we wouldn't be doing this if people weren't buying it. This is really a lower mainland Victoria problem. Outside of that area, people aren't too concerned about the aquaculture practices.
Right.
And so it's been important for us to bring the coalition together to raise that awareness of what's at stake should the Minister of Fisheries do what she did in the Discovery Islands, where she just simply struck a pen and got rid of 600 jobs.
Yes, and I understand that has recently been, that decision was recently reversed. I think just last week the court has intervened a little too late, I might say, but they've intervened and now they've allowed the companies to go through a different process, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so the companies will be working towards trying to find a way to work within the Discovery Islands.
Okay.
And that's really what led us to build the coalition, is because while the Discovery Islands is a huge component of it, there's farms on the west coast of Vancouver Island. I have 3 farms within my traditional territory of the Tlowitsis Nation.
Okay.
There are farms outside of the DI that are operating, and we need to make sure that those livelihoods continue to bring human well-being to our communities.
Well, Dallas, I just want to say thank you for sharing all of the items that you shared with us today. It's very, very appreciated. We are out of time, but I would like to take this opportunity to invite you back after the federal decision is made public in the next couple of months around the 79 licenses that are in question. And then that would also give us the opportunity to talk about the new location for your community and what those plans look like for you and your nation. So thank you again, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Look forward to it, Mary Ruth. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for watching Upfront. Please join us again.